My guest today is Mark Galeotti. Mark has published over 30 books on Russian politics, security, and organized crime. Today, we discuss the latest Ukraine peace plan, the resiliency of the Putin regime, the Russian way of war, and the future of this war. Okay, let's go.
Conflict, politics, military-industrial complex, technology, war. The Flash Traffic Podcast.
I'm a little disappointed because I think we're on the same page on the negotiations. I listened to some of your latest In Moscow Shadows, and yeah, I agree with you on a lot of the points on the negotiations. There might not be a lot of conflict between you and I on what.
Well, manufacture something.
Yeah. Do you, just to play devil's advocate a little bit, obviously I, as you are, I'm sure, want Ukraine to win and you want Russia to get what's coming to them. But just to play devil's advocate, do you think this negotiation, which is highly on in Russia's favor, do you think it goes far enough to appease Russia, given the situation on the ground in Ukraine?
Yeah. It may not. I mean, I think this is the thing, particularly once we start drilling into the detail and security guarantees for Ukraine and the like, it may be that ultimately Putin will decide, nope, this doesn't work for me. Or it may well be that he doesn't anticipate it working for him. I mean, this is a great opportunity to put the cat among the pigeons, create more grounds for possible dissent within Europe, between Europe and America, between America and Ukraine, and such like. I mean, my view is not that, this is going to be how we find peace. It's that until we engage, we can't find out. Mm-hmm. Until we actually see, because, this is very much a back of the envelope plan, until we see how Putin responds, we're just guessing.
And we've been here before. I mean, we've been here, it feels like many times, like during the last almost 4 years. But Ukraine has never been in such a difficult position, except for maybe like March or April of 2022, when Boris Johnson supposedly convinced Zelensky to keep fighting, supposedly, which
supposedly, definitely, yes.
So, but I have never seen Ukraine in such a tight position since the very beginning of the war. We've got the blackouts, which seem to be the worst blackouts in Kyiv that I've seen in 3.5 years. Zelensky is obviously embattled politically. Pokrovsk has fallen or will very soon fall. Kupiansk is rumored now, at least by Putin, that they've taken Kupiansk. It's not looking good. We're at a punctuated equilibrium here in this war. It favors Russia right now more than
it does. And then particularly because it's also the fact that with the United States having already essentially withdrawn, not quite all, but pretty much all the financial assistance, really it's Europe that is having to bankroll this war. And the thing about Europe is European economies are not in the strongest position at the moment. They've committed themselves to massive rearmament programs. They've committed themselves to massive economic development programs in order to try and compete better on the global marketplace. And they've committed themselves to massive levels of support for Ukraine. And as if that wasn't enough, there's the rise of populist parties, many of which are pretty Ukraine skeptical. And even others that aren't have got other priorities. Maybe it's green energy or tax breaks or greater welfare spending or whatever. Now, there's no way that Europe can cover all these different commitments. But at the same time, just as a little sort of note on the other side, we also have to recognize that the Russian economy is sliding into recession. That although they're still able to recruit something like 30,000 soldiers a month, which allows them to pretty much cover their losses, to do that, they're having to up the level of payments that they offer. So there is some sense that they might be beginning to come to the end of that particular pool of manpower, which will mean they would have to turn either to conscripts or to mobilize reservists, either of which would be very, very politically problematic. So there is, I mean, yes, I absolutely agree with you that Ukraine is in a very tight spot, especially when you also throw in the impact of the current corruption crisis there. But let's not pretend that there aren't reasons why, if he gets the right deal, Putin might be tempted to actually accept it rather than just simply always think there's going to be a better deal waiting 6 months, 12 months down the line.
So, this war the fate of Europe has always been in Europe's hands from the beginning of this war, but probably more so now. You touched on it a little bit, but I want to be clear. Do you think that Europe, one, can do it, and two, will they do it?
Well, it depends which it is. I mean, support Ukraine indefinitely? I think that's actually a difficult ask, quite frankly. Especially because it's, as I say, it's very hard to see how that doesn't have to come at the expense, to some degree, of the rearmament program. Now, this is chickens coming home to roost. For so long, Europe essentially infantilized itself by remaining under the American security umbrella, and therefore, in the main, there are exceptions, not spending anywhere near enough on defense and security. And now it finds that actually not having built up that muscle mass, suddenly you find yourself feeling both vulnerable and also not being taken seriously on the geopolitical scene. But the point is, you don't build up military power overnight. This is something that takes years or indeed decades to do, of sustained spending and planning and so forth. So I think there is a degree to which actually Europe is going to find itself in a difficult position. And all the huffing and puffing and the geopolitical posturing of European leaders, and it's worth noting, if you think of the three main European leaders, Chancellor Merz of Germany, Sir Keir Starmer of Britain, and Emmanuel Macron of France, all of them are, to a degree, facing political troubles, especially Starmer and Macron. And therefore, even just their capacity to be able to promise and be able to carry through anything more than the shortest terms of, shortest term commitments, that has to be brought into question.
Did it surprise you that it was the Belgians who stymied the frozen Russian fund release?
Well, no.
Did that surprise you?
Not really. I mean, one should never assume that the Belgians are necessarily not going to be interested in their own self-interest. But the main thing is, look, the money's sitting in Belgium. All these other countries saying, look, we have to seize these frozen sovereign Russian assets because that's actually our lifeline, because, the money would have been used to provide a loan for Ukraine that Ukraine would then use to buy European military kit. So in effect, this would have been Europe paying itself. But the point is, the Belgians made, and I think it's actually a perfectly reasonable one, is look, the Russians have already indicated that they would turn litigious. We might find ourselves on the hook for at least 200 billion euros. Mm. And what they were actually just simply saying, look, you all want this money taken, fine, but all be willing to pay your, if need be, to pay your share to indemnify us. And that's suddenly when all the European countries said, no, we were very happy with the idea of free money, but we don't actually want to have any responsibility for it. And again, I think this is the issue that it speaks to a bigger meta issue, is that pare away all the grandiose rhetoric of European leaders about how this is an existential struggle for Europe as well, and they're going to support Ukraine in every way necessary for as long as it takes and such like. Their actions do not bear that out. Their actions do not, in the main, I mean, again, there are exceptions, but, especially the countries that are not frontline states, clearly do not seem to regard this as an existential struggle. If they did, then we'd be in a very different situation. So I think, again, in this respect, the Belgians were being self-interested, but no less self-interested, no more self-interested than all the other European countries as well.
Mm-hmm. We talk a lot about what is the future of NATO and how is NATO going to operate possibly without U.S. support, and will there be a NATO? There's not a lot of talk about what this could mean to the EU. Could you see a scenario where the EU is kind of reformed, where some members of the EU currently are dropped. And this, the reason we have, in theory, the reason why some of these countries that are not really monetary contributors to the EU, it stabilizes the continent. To have them in the EU. Can you see a scenario where some of these smaller, more cantankerous countries are dropped, and then possibly Ukraine is added to the EU in short order as soon as this war is over?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different issues there, and I'm going to try not to then pontificate for the next hour about EU politics, especially since, as a British citizen, I'm not in it anymore. Look, I think, first of all, yeah, there are those people who push for example, excluding Hungary. Hungary, which has long been the awkward squad member, and particularly, not because I think Viktor Orban is pro-Russian. It's that I think Viktor Orban, the leader of Hungary, is pro-Viktor Orban, and he likes basically playing Brussels and Moscow against each other. But as soon as you start getting into that point of we believe in freedom and democracy, and anyone who doesn't agree with our particular version of that, we will exclude. That's actually a dangerous route to take. Then you have the issue of whether or not actually European Union reform simply means more centralization. And if you look at, Ursula von der Leyen, the sort of chairwoman of the European Commission, she's very keen on that. She was quite keen on the idea of actually having a European army. Though it was also, frankly, is always a bit of a silly idea. She now wants to have a separate European intelligence service when actually Europe's already got something called INTCEN. There are clearly centralizing impulses there, which again, I think could cause a lot of stress and strain if they were pushed too far. But you also mentioned Ukrainian membership, and that's a really interesting one because it's not only is it mentioned in the 28-point plan, but the Russians have been very explicit that although they are dead set against NATO membership, they're fine with EU membership. And in part, I think that's because Putin doesn't really rate the EU. He doesn't really believe it exists in many ways. And in part, it's because I think they have a feeling that it will be incredibly disruptive to the EU to have an early Ukrainian membership. I mean, because interesting, if you look, for example, at Poland, Poland has been dead set supportive of Ukraine in its struggle against Russia. But you also had the spectacle of Polish farmers blockading roads because they were opposing the influx of cheap Ukrainian agricultural products, which didn't really meet EU standards. So I think the idea is that this actually would in practice be very disruptive, not least because Ukraine is poor. And the way the EU works is that the richer countries support the uplift of the poorer ones, and you'd have a bunch of countries that at present receive money from the EU suddenly will have to be expected to contribute because of the potential black hole that Ukraine offers. So I think there's all sorts of complexities here, and I think one way or the other the EU will have to do one of two things: either change quite dramatically, which quite possibly means bringing Ukraine into it, which means also military guarantees for Ukraine. I mean, given that the EU's treaty is a lot more actually directive than NATO's Article 5, which is quite woolly, just simply says, oh, well, member states will provide appropriate support if someone's invaded. No, the EU's treaty says that members will actually provide aid up to and including military support. So it'll either have to change quite dramatically to incorporate Ukraine, or it'll do what it often does, is it'll just muddle through and pretend that a crisis isn't a crisis and hope that just over the horizon, everything will work out.
And as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, somewhere in the EU charter, the contribution to the less wealthy countries is somewhat based on land mass. Is that true? I don't know if that's a rumor. If that's true.
Yeah, I mean, if that's true, that's a big deal. Yeah.
It's a big deal for Ukraine since it's huge. Yeah, you mentioned intelligence support and consolidating intelligence in Europe. Has this conflict really brought to a head the amount of intelligence that Europe is dependent on the U.S. for?
Yeah, well, I mean, it should, because precisely, I mean, after all, the United States is an intelligence superpower. And although, well, Britain does punch well above its weight, and GCHQ, it's equivalent to the NSA, is a very effective organization. Nonetheless, there's no way that it can possibly even begin to sort of reach US levels, and most European countries don't have anything like that either. I mean, I think really what is brought to the fore is not just that the Americans have capabilities that the Europeans just can't match, but also an issue that I must admit has been one of my hobby horse concerns for a long, long time, way before this conflict, is with NATO, you have this notion that there is some kind of common figure, that minimum figure that every member should put into defense. Used to be 2% of GDP, now it's 3.5%. And look, most members are not going to reach this level. Or if they reach this level, at least in part, it's going to be because of nifty little accounting shortcuts, which allow them to sort of reclassify things as defense spending or whatever. But still, it establishes the principle that if you're going to benefit from a security alliance, then you also have to be able and willing to contribute to it. What we don't have, certainly within the European Union, is any sense of a common baseline of spending on intelligence and counterintelligence. And the result is there are literally orders of magnitude of difference between the amount of GDP or proportion of GDP spent in these areas and those not. And within an alliance, that matters because in terms of counterintelligence, so long as you have intelligence sharing, then frankly, the weakest link is where it all matters. And also in terms of being able to rely on, not have to rely on American intelligence capacity, there it matters. One can look at, and I don't want to make it sound as if this is the Belgium bashing segment of the podcast, but if one looks at Belgian spending on counterintelligence, it's ruinously low, despite the fact that Brussels is the administrative capital really of the EU, whereas other countries actually spend much more seriously. If you're looking at the Baltic states or Poland, for example, they spend much more seriously on this. So again, hopefully, if something positive, one of the positive things that could come out of this ghastly war is an awareness that actually within an alliance, security is not just simply about tanks and guns. It's also about spies, other intelligence capacities, and indeed your counterintelligence capacities.
Mm-hmm. And does it seem like Europe's counterintelligence capacity has been strained in the last 10 years by Russian gray warfare techniques that have also seemed to be coming to a head in the last 2 years or so?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the irony. I mean, we had in 2022, after the invasion, massive and overdue expulsions of intelligence officers under diplomatic cover all across, well, not just Europe, but the West more broadly. And yes, and that was really important and absolutely for a short-term serious crimp on Russia's capacities to run intelligence operations. But what I think really wasn't done adequately was to game plan the next stages. Remember, the Russians are not fools, especially when it comes to intelligence activity. There are smart, morally bankrupt men in various offices in the Lubyanka, in the Foreign Intelligence Services headquarters at Yasienova, who would immediately be thinking, well, okay, if we can't operate the old way, we're not going to just simply say, oh, well, it was nice while it lasted. They would think of new ways to operate. And particularly, they have pivoted to this use of proxies, recruiting locals, often who are not in any way political, but just simply local thugs and opportunists, often recruited on the internet, quite frequently not even knowing that they're working for Russia. And this has created a whole new challenge for European counterintelligence because, they're used to the old way where, you follow the second cultural attaché or whatever, and you see whom they meet and such like. Now it's just some guy who has no particular Russian leanings, but who just happens to be on some bulletin board in the dark web, been engaged to help, I don't know, burn down a shopping mall or something like that. And not only does this sort of represent a new kind of threat, it also coincides with a massive increase in Chinese intelligence activity. So it's not as if you can just simply do what, for example, we saw within the FBI after 9/11, where you think, wow, terrorism, that's the challenge, and you pivot all your resources to that. Now, if you focus too much on the Russians, who are a kind of a more immediate and pyrotechnic threat, you might end up actually giving a lot of ground to the Chinese, who arguably in the longer term are a much more serious challenge.
It was rumored that the Polish railway assault or attack last week was conducted by a Ukrainian citizen. I don't know if that was found out to be fact, but what do you think Europe has responded appropriately to Russia's activities inside Europe? Do you think they've been too passe? They've, allowing this to happen without a coordinated response?
I mean, it's very difficult actually to respond. Yes, by the way, certainly the Polish authorities are claiming that those railway attacks carried out by 2 Ukrainians who since had sort of sifted into Belarus. And again, that's the problem nowadays. There's sort of the ethnicity of the Russian proxies can be anyone. In terms of the response, it's very difficult because look, when something happens, drones flying over airports and closing them, causing huge amounts of traffic disruption, or fire bombings or whatever else, there's always a call for, well, we should fight fire with fire. The thing is, it's actually bloody difficult to do that. First of all, because we're meant to be the good guys. So essentially, we have to be constrained by national and international law. Secondly, Russia is in many ways a rather harder target in which to operate. It is an authoritarian police state. And although, for example, the Ukrainians have had some considerable successes in terms of carrying out assassination operations and sabotage and the like, a lot of their people get caught. I mean, it's almost a daily thing if you read the Russian press of someone here, someone there being arrested and the like. And again, that's one thing that in some ways, when you have a wartime mentality, you can live with that because your soldiers are dying on all fronts anyway. So soldiers of the secret front as well. But for democratic countries in a time of ostensible peace, not quite so easy to cope with. And the third issue is in some ways that we're not sure if that just simply would escalate and essentially create a kind of covert arms race. And this is why, if one thinks of classic deterrence theory, there's 2 ways of approaching it. Deterrence by punishment, you try and hit me and I'll hit you harder. Or deterrence by denial, you can try and hit me, but you're not going to be able to cause any serious damage. We're not really going to be able to, I mean, in a few cases, particularly in the cyber realm, there is more scope, but nonetheless, deterrence by punishment is a lot harder for the West to do. What we need to be focusing on is deterrence by denial, because every one of these operations costs the Russians resource. And they're only going to do it because they think it works. And ironically, what happens when some attack happens, you usually get politicians shrieking about exactly how terrible it is, magnifying the effect. I'm not saying we should just pretend these things don't happen, but resilience is one of the key things. We have to accept, just as we did with terrorism, that you do everything you can to prevent the attacks, but some attacks happen. And that's terrible, but you don't let it change your policies and your life. I think that is really going to be one of the ways in which we respond. And it feels very passive. It feels very unsatisfying. But ultimately, it's probably one of our most powerful instruments. It is, to use the old kind of British wartime slogan, all about keeping calm and carrying on.
Do you think that the Ukrainians, who seem very adept at infiltrating and conducting covert operations inside Russia, clearly most of Ukrainians speak Russian, do you think they're underutilized by the EU? And that's because of risk aversion, like you mentioned? Or could they, in the future, be an asset to punish Russia directly?
To be perfectly honest, I think the Ukrainians are doing a pretty damn good job of punishing the Russians directly. And I think the last thing they would want is to, in effect, have their hands tied by, in some ways, acting as proxies of the EU. From their point of view, one has to realize that although on the one hand, the Ukrainians clearly appreciate the support, both practical and moral and political, that they've received from the West generally, there is also a limit to how far they trust the West. Because clearly we have shown we have interests and there's things we're not willing to do to support them, whether it's in terms of sending them more money or more weapons or whatever else. So I think really it's important for us to be learning lessons. And to be honest, I think we are. There is a lot of quiet coordination that goes on. It's not just simply about handing over an intelligence package. There's actually a lot of mutual lessons learned happening. But when it comes down to it, I think really the Ukrainians unleashed are a lot more effective than they would be partially leashed by some kind of connection with the West directly.
I think you're right. I think they're doing a great job inside Russia. Just to kind of close out the peace negotiations, and it's a living document, and they're going to be going back and forth well after Thanksgiving, I think, on this. What is something of the 28, which is now, I heard it's down to 19 points as of this morning, but of the 28 points that were released this weekend, what is salient to you? What stands out that because there's a lot of red herrings in here, and I consider NATO admission the biggest red herring of all, because everyone agrees that they're not going to join NATO. But which one of these stand out as the most salient to you of these points?
I mean, I think that I would mention, first of all, the point about control over the remaining portion of Donetsk region, which for whatever reason, Putin seems to have made one of his absolute demands, that this has to happen. Now, to be brutally honest, there's no genuine strategic reason for this if rump Ukraine is going to get proper security guarantees. It's only really useful as a springboard for future attacks. But in some ways, Putin has made it politically significant and politically important by hammering on about it so much, so that if he doesn't get that now, he will regard that as a defeat. So that, I think, is one. The other one is, I think it was interesting that, again, this is just a framework. It's not a final document in any way. All the detail still has to be sort of sorted out. But in the talk of security guarantees and this idea of a kind of Article 5 like ones, the fact that actually it was made explicit that the United States would be playing a role in the provision of whatever sort of security assistance is involved. Now, again, that can mean much or it can mean little. It could be just simply that they'll provide some weapons and intelligence support like now, or it could actually take the form of direct military strikes. So the implication is it's closer to the latter. We've never seen that before. And I think that does potentially represent a real step forward. Again, the thing is that we're talking on Monday the 24th. We know that the Ukrainians and the Americans got together and have worked on a new rendition. I certainly haven't seen that. We've got some European plans floating around that are frankly non-starters because they look more like attempts to kill off negotiations rather than further them. So, there's a lot of uncertainty and huge devils to be found in the detail. But I think addressing the Donetsk issue and addressing the security guarantees are, for me, I think, the two crucial issues.
Yeah, I think the security guarantees, like you said, the details. What does that actually mean? Because the draft 28 points excluded European boots on the ground inside Ukraine. So it would have to be, if we followed that logic, there's going to have to be some kind of quick reaction force ready in Poland, or who knows what this would look like. And you're right, the territorial part, and then the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. I don't know why Russia would, do they really need half of the energy that comes out of that? I don't know. That's probably going to be heavily negotiated. But the one that's stuck out to me, the one that's the juiciest, is number 26, is no repercussions for wartime actions, amnesty for war crimes, or things that are maybe not considered war crimes, but maybe just crimes in general, which would be the juiciest outcome and would spark so many conspiracy theories or thoughts of corruption. For me, 26 is the one that is both morally reprehensible on its face, but also juicy from a perspective of corruption inside Ukraine. There are some people that say Ukraine is pushing for this to provide amnesty for the Naboo targets inside Zelensky's administration. I mean, it's very juicy to me. Also, like I said, morally irreprehensible to give amnesty to the Russians for what they've done.
It does. Yeah, I mean, look, let's be clear. This is not anything other than, at best, assuming that it sort of emerges in some form like this, a very ugly peace. It is about buying an end to the fighting, making compromises to the aggressor, and in that respect, rewarding aggression, even though clearly Putin won't get anything like what he thought he was going to be getting in February 2022. And I think this is one of the really crucial divides. I mean, I think on the whole, from the Europeans, we've had much more of a focus on what ought to happen, which is lovely and all very well, unless you but not when you have no means of actually making it happen. And so this whole business of amnesties, it sticks in the craw, of course. But at the same time, there's no point in saying, we'd like a peace deal, which also involves you surrendering yourself to a war crimes tribunal in The Hague. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, when there's no point in having negotiations. It is a classic example of the sort of shabby moral compromises that might be involved. And yes, they go two ways. I mean, although clearly it's Russian conduct that the spotlight ought to be shone on because of all kinds of egregious horrors that have been perpetrated, but it goes both ways. If there wasn't this, then there's also scope for the kind of lawfare that would in due course see the Russians trying to actually go after various Ukrainians. I mean, take, for example, General Budanov, head of military intelligence and the guy who's been behind so many of these sabotage and assassination operations. Technically speaking, are Ukraine and Russia at war, or is this a man who carried out crimes? The massive truck bombing on the Crimean Bridge, it does seem to be that the driver of the truck had no idea. It's not like he was a committed Ukrainian patriot doing this. No, he just thought he was just making a delivery across the bridge, which just happened to be a rather explosive one. Again, there is scope for all kinds of mischief, and the one thing the Russians can do is mischief, without something like this to more or less kind of zero things out.
Well, the Ukrainians have said since the beginning of the war, since probably the first 3 months of the war, that Ukraine has won the war. And now they are just jockeying over territory. And they've said that. They still say that because I think at the heart of it, they should and are relieved that their entire country is not under Russian occupation right now, which is a miracle. It's just simply a miracle. So yeah, I guess wait out for the the results of this. If we even, I mean, we've been here so many times. The only reason I have a glimmer of hope that this will get done is unfortunately because Zelensky is so embattled right now politically, and everything's going bad on the battlefield, and Kyiv is in darkness, and on, and it just doesn't look good for the home team right now.
That's true, though. It was interesting. I was talking to different people in Kyiv in recent days, trying to get their sense, because obviously this is the issue. I'm a Russia specialist, not a Ukraine specialist. So whenever I'm talking about Ukrainian politics, I'm really having to rely on the expertise of others. And the interesting thing is there was no consensus as to whether or not Zelensky, who is undoubtedly, as you say, embattled, this is I would say, the greatest crisis, domestic political crisis that he's had to face of his presidency, whether that means that he's less able to say no to the Americans trying to impose a peace on him, or whether it means that he can't afford to say yes, because otherwise he'll be outflanked by the nationalists and so forth. Again, one of the big uncertainties that, we'll just have to wait and see how it plays out.
Yeah, his speech the other day was basically preparing Ukrainians for either contingency.
Absolutely,
it was vague enough that something is going to happen very soon. We just don't know which side this coin's going to land on. But stay tuned. It is clearly, as we go along in this war, every, like I said, punctuated equilibrium will be more important towards the end of the war, towards finishing the war. It probably gets more intense and more has more impact as we go along. So when we do this again next year, those negotiations will have more influence on the actual end of the war than these will have. But wait to see. Let's talk about some of your recent publications. So you have a new release, an updated release of your book. We need to talk about Putin. And that just came out. In there, you touch on Prigozhin, and you touch on what could have been a black swan event, a very significant. It's still a significant event in recent history. What does the Yevgeny Prigozhin revolt say about Russian resiliency of the regime? Does it say that the dichotomy here is that in one hand, it says Russia's weak because look at what happened. You can have a private military company almost take over Moscow. On the other hand, you could say, wow, this happened and Putin is like Teflon. Nothing happened to Putin. No assassination attempts. No, demonstrations in Red Square. What does it say about resiliency?
Yeah, I think that the takeaways are that it demonstrates actually weakness within the system rather than strength. Firstly, that the mutiny ever happened in the first place. I mean, it wasn't an attempt to topple Putin. It wasn't even an attempt. I mean, with 2,000 soldiers, you're not going to take Moscow either. But nonetheless, it was a very powerful piece of symbolism, and it was an attempt to sort of performatively persuade Putin to change his mind and back Prigozhin over his rival Defense Minister Shoigu. But the fact that it happened, firstly, it demonstrates weakness within the Federal Security Service, the main internal security agency. I mean, DVKR, which is its military counterintelligence department. I mean, despite its name, its real function more than anything else is to keep tabs on the military and make sure there's no treasonous thought there. Well, they really missed this. I mean, although they picked up on the plans for the mutiny just before it happened, so it pushed Prigozhin into advancing his timeline briefly, but it shouldn't have got that far. Secondly, again, the fact that a relative handful of mercenaries, a few thousand, were able to take over Rostov-on-Don, the city which was the headquarters of the whole war effort, and then send this sort of flying column heading all the way towards Moscow and almost making it to the Oka River just south of the city. Well, again, that says something about frankly, the disillusion, I think, within the security apparatus. Now, Prigozhin was expecting or hoping at least that there would be defections to his side. There weren't really, I think, about 90 guys all told. But conversely, no one really seemed to be that bothered to try and stop the mercenaries either. The security apparatus in Rostov-on-Don basically stood down and confined itself to barracks. And as this flying column was heading up, I mean, on that fateful Saturday, Viktor Zolotov, Putin's sort of Praetorian Guard commander, head of the Rosgvardia, the National Guard, basically, as I understand it, spent much of the day on the phone trying to contact local commanders along the route of march to get them to do something to try and stop this. And they were doing everything they could to not be contactable. I imagine there were a lot of phones that were sort of dropped in water or eaten by dogs or something, or whatever claims they make, because that was the safest way to make sure you don't receive orders that otherwise you'd either have to flout or obey. So in some ways, if this was a vote of confidence in Putin, what we saw were massive levels of abstentions. And I think that's quite telling, because one of the key assets that Putin has always relied on in a crisis is his control over the security apparatus. And this, for the first time, gave us a sense that actually we can't assume that that's going to be the case. And we've seen this before. If you go back to 1991, when the hardliners launched their August coup against Gorbachev, I remember one of the sort of most dramatic things that day that wasn't on camera was that the police experienced a record level of people calling in sick. Again, it was that sense of people not very enthused, didn't really want to go out and sort of run the risk of having to truncheon down your next door neighbor, but conversely didn't want to openly challenge the new regime just in case it prospered. So they thought, well, just stay home today and see what happens. And then once it's clear that momentum was not with the coup, then they'll find happy coming out to say, no, we're not going to obey. So I think that what it showed is, although this is still, let's be honest, is still a strongly in place regime, there's no signs that it's going to be imminently toppled by some kind of mutiny or coup or public protest. For Putin and for the elite as a whole, this, I think, punctured that automatic assumption that when push comes to shove, the security apparatus will be shoving for Putin.
In your book, you kind of give the impression, or maybe you say it outright, that it's not so much Putin, but the idea or the concept of an authoritarian in charge of Russia. And if Putin gets killed or dies, there are plenty of people ready to take his place.
Well, there are plenty of people ready to take his place, but there's no one person who can just simply move into that Putin-shaped hole we left in the system. In some ways, we're going to be in a position, in my opinion, is particularly if it's sort of that one day Putin just doesn't wake up, that it's going to be like as what happened with the death of Stalin. And I still think the black comedy, the film, The Death of Stalin, is probably one of our best insights into what will happen when it's Putin's turn. Because what we will have is behind the scenes wheeling and dealing between a variety of institutions and individuals, none of whom are strong enough to just simply take power. They'll need to build a coalition. And that's a good thing, because coalition politics tends to drag politics towards the center a little. And I think particularly now, and as every year that goes past, it won't be someone from Putin's circle, because Putin's 73. Pretty much all the people in his circle are between the ages of 70 and 78. It's going to be a generational shift down. And the next generation, they're not the same kind of people. They're not Homo Sovietici. They're not people who really were sort of products of the Soviet system. I'm not saying they're nice people. On the whole, I think that they're ruthless, opportunist kleptocrats. But they're less concerned about great power status and more concerned about stealing on an industrial scale and enjoying the fruits of that theft. So I think it is likely to be a rather different kind of regime that emerges.
How long, if we discount possible economic collapse or any kind of black swan event inside Russia, how long do you think they could continue this war? Just in general.
I mean, that's the difficult one, not least because it precisely largely comes down to the state of the economy. It's the economy that keeps the factories grinding out the weapon systems. It's the economy that allows the state to be able to spend so much money inducing people to volunteer. And it's the economy that is obviously one of the hardest things to predict. The classic thing, if you ask 3 economists, you'll get 4 different opinions as to how long this can go. When it comes down to it, though, first of all, at the moment, the economy is it is going into recession. It's probably in recession now, really. But nonetheless, it's not a real hard crash. It's a slow grind down. It's kind of a little bit like late 1970s Soviet Union, a sort of slide down into shabby stagnation rather than anything more dramatic. Secondly, authoritarian regimes are able to withstand economic trouble that much more easily by essentially dumping the pressure on ordinary people and keeping them suppressed under the jackboot. We've seen that in Iran. We've seen it in North Korea. So, again, this is a system which can continue to spend on the things it wants to spend. And remember, 40% of the federal budget currently goes to security and defense. I mean, it's a massive expenditure. So, look, the honest answer is clearly, I don't know. My suspicion is that Russia can keep up the current tempo of operations for at least another year, possibly 2. Before it really starts to have to kind of slow things down. But the point is that I'm not convinced Ukraine can keep up the current tempo as long. Because again, from Putin's point of view, all he needs to do is to be able to outlast Ukraine.
Mhm.
And in that sense, we might get this conflict resolved, or it might just simply, in due course, begin to cool down as both sides get exhausted. And the scale and the number of offensives and counteroffensives begins to minimize, and the number of drone attacks is reduced and all that kind of thing. But we are still quite some way away from that.
You wrote, published last year, almost exactly a year ago, Forged in War, which I would describe as a comprehensive history of Russia at war, maybe. Um, Given that the history of Russia at war, should we be surprised at what's happening on the battlefield? This slow attrition, the high casualty rate. Should we be more surprised that Russia tried a blitzkrieg type assault early in the war versus a systematic, dismantling of Ukraine?
Yeah, look, I think sometimes it's easy to orientalize the Russians and think, oh, well, human life has no meaning for them. They just use their soldiers as ammunition in every conflict and such like. And in fairness, that's not, as it were, the idea. It's not like the Russians are thinking, great, we can get rid of some surplus population here. It's just that often that ends up being the default. And I think that, yeah, on one level, we absolutely shouldn't be surprised that this has become a war of attrition, because that's where, obviously, from the Russians' point of view, they would naturally pivot after the failure of their blitzkrieg and the decimation of the sort of the higher readiness, the higher quality forces that, the paratroopers, the Spetsnaz, the naval infantry, who in a way would have spearheaded that. And they ended up taking terrible losses in the early months of the war. So although there are now units that are still called air assault or naval infantry or Spetsnaz, they're not a patch on how they were 5 years ago. So, I mean, in that context, in a way, yeah, that plus, of course, the impact of the drone and the degree to which actually now all warfare within 15 to 20 miles of the front line is observable. And if it's observable, it's killable. So I think for all of those reasons, yes. But I think there's also some other things that actually history should tell us or should have reminded us. And one of them actually is the Russian capacity to adapt. And again, there's been a sort of common pattern that usually they fail properly to foresee challenges and issues and to prepare for them. They stumble in and they're surprised and shocked when things don't work out the way that they had in the past or that they'd expected to. And at first, they're really bad at adapting, but then they learn. And actually, if one looks at the tactical adaptation that is taking place, and this is, I think, one of the most worrying things, is, we got so used to regarding the Ukrainians rightly as astonishingly innovative and adaptive, and they absolutely are and were. But it was especially striking in the first 2.5 years of the war, because the Russians were so slow at adaptation. Now, though, the Russians are catching up. And so not only are they adapting in their own ways, obviously different ways from the Ukrainians, but are they adapting, I would suggest, as quickly and as well as the Ukrainians? They're doing so with the advantage of a much greater industrial base behind it. And again, that's something which, if you look at the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, again, there's this myth that it was all just simply about just the sheer numbers of Russians and T-34s being thrown at the Germans. That's actually not the truth. I mean, actually, if one looks at the latter stages of the war, the Russians were actually being a lot more sophisticated. Yes, they had these huge armies, but they were also actually being a lot more tactically and operationally sophisticated. The big difference, and I will get off my soapbox in a moment, is that although the Russians are adapting tactically, there's very little evidence at the moment they're adapting on an operational or a strategic way. And there's a whole bunch of reasons. We can talk about it if you want. But the main thing is, therefore, when one looks at, for example, big military exercises like the recent Zapad ones, which took place in Belarus and northern Russia, I mean, I was looking at it and I was thinking, look, apart from a few drones in the air, this could have been a late Soviet military exercise. All mass armor, carefully choreographed to show just the right things. So it's not really an exercise. It's just, frankly, a military pageant. But it really didn't show any true appreciation of the military lessons that we've learned in recent years. And that's because we got tactical adaptation not matched to anything like that in operational and doctrinal change. And that's in part just because the Russians really don't know what to make of the lessons of this war. They don't know if Ukraine is the way of the future or just the way this particular war turned out.
Mm-hmm. In that same vein, at the very end of Forged in War, you have a glimmer of hope. And you say, quote, "A nation forged in war need not be defined by it forever," end quote. If this armistice does take place, or maybe a peace, is Russia going to have a wake-up call after this that says, okay, we're no longer a superpower imperialistic country, we need to chill out a little bit? Or is this going to be like Chechnya in 1994 and 96, and they're going to come back with a fury in 8 to 10 years? What's your guess?
I mean, that's the interesting and sort of difficult question. Really, this is rooted in Russian strategic culture. And strategic culture is something that evolves over the centuries. And, from Russia's point of view, it has been shaped by insecurity. That sense that this is a country which is going to be assailed from pretty much every direction. We can exclude the north and the main. And often by nations, peoples that are more powerful or more technologically advanced. Whether we're talking about the Mongols in the early medieval era, whether we're talking about the Teutonic Knights, whether we're talking about the Swedes, the Poles, the Nazis, Napoleon, you name it. So it is a culture that is built on insecurity, built on a sense that if it's going to get into a conflict, it has to strike first because it's much more unwieldy than its rivals, and therefore it needs to kind of essentially control the timeline for any conflict. And we saw this in Ukraine. I mean, from Putin's point of view, he's wrong, but nonetheless, his view was that Ukraine was going to become some kind of forward base for NATO, and as such a threat, so he had to strike first to stop that. Now, the fact of the matter is that, firstly, obviously, Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's not even the Tsarist Empire. It is a country which has gone past its imperial peak. And secondly, they're in the nuclear age. Russia no longer faces the threat of existential conquest. Basically, you can, if need be, threaten to blow up the world. And that's a pretty damn powerful way of guaranteeing it. So in some ways, that one could argue, I mean, and frankly, this is something that during the Gorbachev years, we actually saw Gorbachev and other people arguing that Russia needs to redefine its role. The problem is this imperial hangover, this sense that Russia has a right and a duty to control other countries around itself, particularly Slavic ones, this sort of the three Slavic motherlands, as Putin would think of it, as Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. Now, yes, so in that context, there is a chance, and I can say it's no more than a chance, that a bloody nose in Ukraine can do for Russia what, for example, the Suez Crisis did for Britain, or the war in Algeria for France, to be a wake-up call, that in fact, they have to realize that they're no longer the old imperial nation. And if that happens, and I said that's the most optimistic understanding, it's not going to happen overnight. It's something that takes place generationally. I mean, let's be brutally honest, Britain and France haven't entirely abandoned some of their imperial pretensions. But we're getting there. So yes, if we think of it in the grand historical sweep, this may be the beginning of some kind of a change in Russia, but it will be a contested issue. You're going to have the ultra-nationalists saying, as they are saying now, that actually the problem was Putin was weak. He didn't go in hard enough. He should have thrown 1 million soldiers into the invasion, and he should have threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons or seriously or whatever else. So you're going to get them saying, actually, the moral of the story is Russia needs to be more brutal. And lots of other people saying, no, actually, the moral of the story is we shouldn't be so damn stupid to get ourselves involved in major land wars that we can't really win.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope it's the latter. I hope they learn their lesson from this.
Absolutely.
Mark Galeotti, thank you so much. This has been a great chat.
My pleasure.
The new version of your book has just been released. We need to talk about Putin. And I have to say, the line in that book that stood out for me that has nothing to do with Putin, really, that I thought was funny, a great line, I have to tell you. Quote, Mikhail Gorbachev reformed the Soviet Union out of existence. I thought that was a great line. That made me laugh.
That's
right.
frankly would be his obituary.
Oh, well, that was great. Thanks, Mark. This is a good chat. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Flash Traffic Podcast.